I'm Aaliyah Faust and so excited to be with you today. Kyle, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, first, congrats on the new series. It's coming just in time for election, and I love how timely it is and how you're tying in the comedy with the news young people can actually use. So, first, what inspired the series?
That's a great question. Thank you, by the way. The thing that inspired the series was, there we realized there wasn't a show out there about politics that I identified with, and in the past, I've had different show producers and people reach out and say, "Hey, can you host this show that we have, this political show we have?" And I would look at the pitch deck, and usually, we live in a polarized world, so a lot of times it was a really vitriolic script, or it was like very much us versus them kind of mentality, and that's not really who I am. It's not what I like about what I do. So we got to the point where I'm like, my writing partner Raman and I sort of thought like, what if we create the show we want, which would be like the humor of Daily Show or Chappelle Show, and you combine that, but instead of like the Daily Show reacting to the 24-hour news cycle, what if that section of it was CBS Sunday Morning, which is this like wholesome attitude? And if you combine the two, then you have a funny monologue at the top, but then you talk about a particular issue in the 22 minutes, make people laugh, and hopefully the audience feels empowered instead of feels like there's nothing they can do. So that was the idea behind putting this show together.
I love all the topics you're going to be diving into, but I quickly want to touch on three. And the first one is education. So you're very well educated. I didn't even know that before, how deeply educated you were until I started reading about this show and things. You're very well traveled and voiced in a bunch of fields. So what educational options do you approve of when it comes to quality education and setting goals and just kind of knowing your worth?
Thank you. That's such a nice thing to say. Look, I had the privilege of growing up in a place that had a really amazing public high school system. My parents were immigrants. They couldn't send us to fancy private schools. That's most people's experience in America. And I was blessed that we had a great public school system. So that really launched me in a way that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I'm really passionate about funding public education in the right way. On our show, we wanted to avoid doing segments that people have done before. There's so many great shows that have done segments on student debt or things like that. And we thought, well, let's look at college versus trade school. Those are two things that unfortunately people end up pitting against each other in arguments, right? People will say, oh, you went to college because you're an elite. And other people will say, you only went to trade school because you couldn't afford college. And it's like, can we just stop, please, with that? Because the reality is we need people who are learning a trade, and we need people who are going to a four-year college for our economy to do well. The biggest threat to both of those people is automation, jobs that are no longer jobs because computers can do them. And other countries like India and China and Brazil are investing in science and technology and engineering and math. And are they doing that in a way that we're not? Because that's what we should focus on. Like if you're a young conservative or if you're a young progressive, I'm not interested in pitting college versus trade school. I'm interested in learning about what the solutions are to make sure that automation doesn't take all our jobs away, so that our economy, when we're old, is still strong. And when our kids are growing up, that they still have something to look forward to. So that's kind of our approach to this show. And it's also something that we take from like the background that I've had, I guess.
So second is healthcare. Definitely glad to see you approve it for the larger community. So in your opinion, why is universal healthcare important?
Look, we live in the world's richest, most powerful country, and the philosophical argument seems to be whether we believe that there should be the role of government in healthcare. I think most people, if you look at things that certainly both presidential candidates have been saying, of course, you should fact check both of them, but at least the narrative seems to be that there is a role for the government to play in making sure that people have access to healthcare. People have different practicalities to how they're going to achieve that. Our show doesn't focus on candidates, so what we're focusing on is what's the playing field for healthcare right now? Like, how do people access it? What's the cost? And we haven't shot that episode yet, but the idea that we have is to really look at how privilege affects that. Like, I live in New York City, and there are some hospitals where if you're rich, I mean, you're picking from like a 4-course menu at your hospital bed. That's insane to me when I found that out. I'm like, so if you're that wealthy, you're not just going in for your surgery, but like you're either paying for it on your own or you have the kind of health insurance. How does a hospital like that even exist? I don't understand. I get it if you're like, under police protection for something, you should have a protected area, but the idea that that's our reality in the richest, most powerful country. So we're looking at those inequities. And of course, we're laughing at how silly it is that that exists in our country, but we're focusing on the solutions to that, right? Like most people will agree that it is crazy that that's something that exists in one of our cities, probably more of our cities, but that's not how we're leaving the audience. What we're leaving the audience with then is, here are some resources to learn how you fit into healthcare. What you need to do now is look at the candidates who are running in your local community, who are running for Senate or House in the district that you live in. You can vote based on, if you think this is okay and a good idea, and plenty of people do, vote for the person that believes that. If you don't think it's a good idea, look up who's running on the other side. There's never going to be a perfect candidate for any of us. Like, we're just not going to agree with 100% of what anybody thinks. But the reality is, if there's 12 things that somebody's doing that you agree with, isn't 12 better than 0? Like, shouldn't we put in the little bit of work to figure out who the person is to vote for? And that's one of the messages of the episode on healthcare.
I'm glad you brought up voting. So last but certainly not least, what do you say to those who kind of feel like their vote doesn't make a difference?
Yeah, look, one of the terrible things about voter disenfranchisement is that it's designed to make us feel powerless. But when you think about it, the reason that people in positions of power go to such great lengths to make us feel powerless is because they're scared of the power we have. That's just the reality of it. If they weren't scared, they wouldn't try so hard to prevent us from voting. I'm really excited that this year, more than any other year, there's so much dialogue about, can you vote by mail-in ballot? Do you live in a place where you can vote 2 weeks before an election? Can you vote early? If you're young now, right? If there's some states where you can be 16 years old and be a poll worker and get paid for it. A lot of poll workers tend to be older people, but this year, because of COVID, a lot of them are at a higher risk, so they may not volunteer. So can you be a young person who can like put on your PPE gear, maintain your social distancing, and be there for your community? There's so many things that we know about now that just weren't in the public eye, even in the last election cycle. And then I think the most important thing is, like, we're not just voting for president, we're voting for so many other offices. Those offices can be decided by the 8 votes that you and your friends bring to the table. Like, if you can convince 8 of your friends to vote, some of the districts you live in, that might be what sways it. Of course, if you live in a Florida or Wisconsin or someplace like that, your vote for president matter is weighted a whole lot more. But even if you're a conservative in a place like New York City, or if you're a progressive in a place like Mississippi, you might not feel like your vote matters, but it does, because if enough people have moved the needle, let's say in Mississippi, the progressive vote increases by 5%. Guess what? The people who represent you are going to be like, oh man, why did the progressive vote increase by 5%? At some point, we're going to have to address the needs of these people, and we're going to have to move our policies. Same thing in New York. If you're a conservative, it's a fairly liberal city, but if the conservative vote increased, those people in positions of power are going to have to be like, why did this increase? I'm going to have to start paying attention. So it's never a wasted vote. If anything, it continues to move things in a direction.